Today, we will be speaking to Dr. Tenelle Porter on the topic of what is intellectual humility. Dr. Porter is currently a postdoctoral scholar at the University of Pennsylvania. She received her PhD from Stanford University. Before she joined the University of Pennsylvania, she was a postdoctoral scholar at the University of California, Davis. Her work focuses on understanding psychological processes that promote learning for imperfect learners, navigating imperfect systems. These psychological processes include growth mindset and intellectual humility. Her work has been funded by Joan Templeton Foundation and Google. She's published in top-tier journals including Psychological Science, Social Psychological and Personality Science, and many more.
So welcome, Tenelle. Thanks for speaking today. What I started to start out with first is just ask a little bit about what first got you interested in intellectual humility.
I became interested in intellectual humility when I was a graduate student. I was studying education, how we can learn as much as possible. I was also interested in adolescence. And I was in this setting in graduate school where I was getting to meet with a lot of different kind of professors. And something that struck me was that there were some professors who just had this way of navigating knowledge that seemed very open, that they were very willing to concede that they didn't know everything, even about their specialty. And others were not that way. They would sort of become threatened or dogmatic in a way about their views. And so I noticed that in these professors and was curious about it, and also wondering how can we help young people succeed as much as possible, given the challenges of the 21st century. And at that time, it was a while ago, but we were still even seeing this kind of rise in political polarization in our democracy and folks having a hard time talking with one another across difference. And so a question for me was, well, how can we equip young people with the skills that they would need to have a conversation with someone who doesn't necessarily share their views in order to kind of support our democratic society? So all of those questions were bouncing around in my head. And I hadn't heard of the concept of intellectual humility before graduate school, but was able to read more about it. And there'd been some philosophers writing about it even before I became interested in it. So I read a lot of the philosophical research about it because there really wasn't any empirical research on it when I began my doctoral study.
That's fantastic. You're a pioneer of scientific research, especially psychological research of intellectual humility. So I would like to ask you about some of your work on intellectual humility. You developed the intellectual humility scale, and you recently published a paper that clarifies numerous concepts of intellectual humility. Would you please tell us a little bit about what intellectual humility is and what are the key characteristics of intellectual humility?
In our recent paper, I and some collaborators reviewed the empirical research literature, which really exploded in the last 10 years. And we found 18 different definitions of intellectual humility in the published research. So there is a lot of conceptual sort of confusion about what are we even talking about here. And we're not always talking about the same thing. So and my own journey of understanding what is intellectual humility has kind of changed. So it's become in a way more complex and more simple at the same time. In my earlier work, some colleagues and I defined intellectual humility as a recognition of your intellectual limitations, being willing to recognize your intellectual limitations and valuing the intellect of other people. I think, though, it's also important to distinguish between parts of intellectual humility that are happening in our heads, these cognitive parts where we're questioning our beliefs or wondering if we might be wrong or recognizing that we don't know everything, and behavioral parts of intellectual humility. So what we do with that recognition of our limitations, how we behave with others. I think in the recent paper, how I kind of organized the concept of intellectual humility was to think of it as 4 quadrants. One being that we cognitively recognize that we ourselves don't know everything and we have limitations, that we recognize that there may be value in what other people know, that we are willing to express our recognition of our own limitations by admitting it when we don't know something, admitting when we make mistakes, and that we're also willing to express a recognition of value of other people's intellect by listening to others, not automatically dismissing their perspective. For me, though, the core of intellectual humility really is this first cognitive step of recognizing that we are fallible creatures, that we don't know everything, and that we sometimes get things wrong. And I think that the social and behavioral aspects of intellectual humility really flow from that core recognition.
Thank you. That's really excellent. We really like that paper you published recently. I noticed that there are increasing interest and scientific research about intellectual humility recently. Why is intellectual humility important? Why do we care about it now?
I think a lot about this question of why intellectual humility is important and whether it even is important. I think that this does come down to the fact that we as humans are fallible, that so much of psychology has shown us that we have false beliefs, we get things wrong. To paraphrase Karl Popper, that our knowledge is finite, but our ignorance is infinite. And so intellectual humility to me is a way to respond to that human fallibility that's inevitable. I think it's also really important because intellectual humility is a way of putting the truth first, as a way of kind of saying, we're here to learn and discover and understand what's true, not to just kind of stick to our original beliefs. When we set out for truth, we shouldn't presume to already know what the truth is. And I think intellectual humility keeps us in that place where we remain open. And without it, I think that we can become stuck in our limited views. We have difficulty growing beyond that. So when I think about why it matters for today, there are several different contexts where it seems really relevant. One is our polarized society, where again, it's really difficult to even converse across difference. And I think we see this threatening the functioning of our democracy in various ways. And so to the extent that we can come into those conversations recognizing that we don't know everything and that we might have something to learn from someone else, I think our society will be better off and our democracy will be more healthy. I think it's also really relevant to scientists and these conversations happening now about the credibility revolution. How do we as scientists remain open to the possibility that even our really hard-earned work that's come before might be incorrect and that we might need to switch course? Because scientific discovery sort of depends on our willingness to shift course when it's necessary. So I think intellectual humility speaks to that. And then also, of course, just learning and kind of being open to learning. And I think that we see with the pandemic that we've learned so much. We continue to learn and there's a lot of uncertainty, but there was a sense of resistance among some members of the public when guidelines would shift for the pandemic. When we need to update the way that we were interacting with one another based on what we were learning about the virus. And there's a sense that we should have already known, or why are we changing our minds? I think that intellectual humility allows us to be more nimble and kind of stay up to date and just acknowledge that we are going to change our mind as part of being human, that we don't always know what's right at the start and we learn new things and then we change our mind. So in all of those areas, I think it can be really helpful.
Putting truth first is such an important point. Our next question is, intellectual humility is often treated as a trait, a character virtue, or personality. However, a few recent studies, including yours, successfully manipulate intellectual humility experimentally. What was the biggest challenge in changing the level of intellectual humility?
It was quite challenging to change intellectual humility. I could say that some of our attempts failed, that sometimes an attempt would work and then we would try to replicate it and then it would fail. And so I think one of the challenges was trying to move a very general sense of intellectual humility, this kind of general recognition that your beliefs might be wrong, without tailoring that recognition to a specific context or a specific set of beliefs. So I think there's been a bit more success in shifting people's beliefs about certain things or their confidence in their knowledge about a very specific issue. But when it becomes more general, it becomes harder to kind of move that around with a brief manipulation. And I don't think that our manipulations, which were quite brief, had any lasting effect outside of the study context. We were, again, just trying to see if we could identify maybe a psychological lever to shift people's mindset about intellectual humility. But I think that to produce longer lasting change, we need a more involved intervention.
You talked a lot about political polarization, like how you started with all your interest in intellectual humility. And this sort of leads to my question for you. So in your study with Dr. Schumann, you examined people's openness to opposing views with regards to gun control and also capital punishment. Why did you choose these two issues? And I think they were both political. So do you think like political issues are sort of different from other issues when people choose to whether to be intellectually humble? And do you think that there are some ways we can sort of manipulate their intellectual humility so that we can reduce maybe the extremity in political extremists?
For that study that you mentioned, we focused on two sociopolitical issues because those are really polarizing topics. People tend to be really strongly on one side or the other. And we wanted to see if even in this context where it's hard to have conversations across difference, if intellectual humility would be one of these dispositions that helped people to do that helped to make them more open to learning about the opposite side, even when they were pretty firm in their belief about a certain issue. We did find in that study that even when we controlled for the strength of their attitude views or their political ideology, individuals who were still intellectually humble, were still more open to learning about the opposing view. This was suggesting at least some continuity among people who had really strong convictions and those who didn't, that if you were intellectually humbler, you were always more open to learning about the opposing view. And I'll say though that, we tested this hypothesis with those two specific views on gun control and capital punishment, but we didn't test an entire universe of views. And so I do not know if we would have found that effect for every single polarizing issue. And I'm not an expert in different kinds of issues, so I'd say that more work needs to be done to explore what particular issues and what features of those issues might kind of moderate this association. Some of the work by Rick Hoyle, for example, and his colleagues shows that people can be intellectually humble about some issues and not others. So I could be really intellectually humble about Russia invading Crimea, but not intellectually humble about my views on vaccines, for example. So, and I think we need to be open to the fact that it might not be virtuous to be intellectually humble about all issues. In fact, you could even argue in the same way that it's not always virtuous to be honest in all situations. And the same should hold true for intellectual humility. So trying to understand when is this a virtue and when is it not based on the issue is an open question and would be great to explore. I'll say just as a last thing to your point on extremism, we did have a community sample for this study, so we weren't targeting extremists. That we found the association held even when we controlled for the strength of attitudes gives some indication that intellectual humility is still potent, even among those who have really strong views. But it'd be great to replicate this study by targeting a population that is extreme and seeing if we even see a distribution of intellectual humility within that population. My prediction would be that if we do find that distribution, we'd still see this effect holding, but it's an empirical question. I'd love to see what happened if someone did that study.
So could you please tell us a little bit about your current study about intellectual humility in the classroom?
What I'm really interested in now, and this is work with a couple of collaborators, I'm really interested in understanding how we can create classrooms where all students feel confident expressing intellectual humility. So publicly revealing when they don't know something or when they're confused. And this project is really about understanding what are the factors in the classroom that make it hard or easier for students to express intellectual humility. So as one example, in some work with Andre Simpian, we're finding that school cultures and contexts that really emphasize innate intellectual ability or brilliance, that those contexts make it a lot harder for students to feel comfortable expressing intellectual humility in the classroom. That seems to be one of the barriers. I'm also learning through some qualitative research and open-ended surveys that students who are minoritized or underrepresented in certain settings face more barriers when it comes to speaking up or revealing what they don't know because their competence in classrooms is already negatively stereotyped. So it brings even more risk for those students to speak up if they're confused. And so a next step is really going to be to try to understand how can we change that about classrooms so that all students feel more confident voicing their questions to learn.
That's such a brilliant study. I look forward to reading your paper. Studying intellectual humility scientifically can be difficult and challenging. What difficulties have you had in your research or in general, and how did you overcome them?
It is a very challenging topic to study. So I would say that one challenge facing the field too, and facing me in my work, is trying to find this balance between capturing intellectual humility on one hand and confidence on the other. trying to understand when does intellectual humility become too much of a good thing, and why is that? How can we capture sort of appropriate calibration of intellectual humility? When is it good to stand your ground and not doubt or not question your beliefs? And when do we need to do that? So those are just complexities and nuances that I think about a lot and that are challenging. And I think that one way we can begin to kind of unpack those issues and explore them more deeply is by trying to understand intellectual humility in context. And so kind of moving a bit away from these very general trait measures of intellectual humility to understanding what does it do in this situation? And what does it look like in that situation? And is it beneficial for this person in that situation? Really mapping the terrain of when it's helpful, when it's not, and why. Yeah, would help address some of those challenges, nuances, and complexities.
There was interesting symposium last year in May about intellectual humility. A lot of researchers seem that they are discussing about how can we measure intellectual humility reliably, because it is basically sort of a golden mean and happy medium between intellectual civility and intellectual arrogance. And it seems like methodologically also really challenging. I think your suggestion focusing on specific context seems really great remedy to such a difficulty. So our last question is, you're a pioneer in this field, and where do you see the future of this field headed from your perspective?
So right off the bat, something that comes to mind is that there are lots of questions that we're having as a society right now about equity. I think that intellectual humility can be part of those conversations. Intellectual humility research so far hasn't really dealt with questions of equity. So how does intellectual humility relate to dynamics of power? Is it more incumbent upon groups who are in power to show intellectual humility than it is incumbent upon groups who have less power in society? At what point does intellectual humility impede or benefit activism and social action and democratic action in our communities? Could it be that intellectual humility is sometimes detrimental to activism or taking action to remedy a social ill? Or is it beneficial in all cases? So getting into these dynamics of equity, I think, is interesting. And something that I wonder about is, how is the expression of intellectual humility received depending on who the person expressing the intellectual humility is and what their group membership is? So for example, if a professor of color expresses intellectual humility, is that received in the same way as if a white professor expresses intellectual humility? So those are some ideas, but really walking down this path and really exploring and pushing on, how does intellectual humility interface with these concerns about equity?
I think those are great future research ideas. Thank you for sharing with us and everyone watching this interview. Okay, Dr. Porter, thanks for speaking with us today. It was wonderful to hear your thoughts and have this opportunity. Ask the Experts interview with Dr. Tenelle Porter from the University of Pennsylvania. We hope you enjoy it, and thank you so much.